New York City. July 26, 1919. Lightning streaks through the sky as an electrical storm breaks over the city. It's about 11 p.m. and Thomas Tanner Smith, boss stevedore, sits in the Marginal Club playing cards with 5 associates. Until the onset of World War I, Tanner was infamous in his bailiwick for being a cop fighter and the head of the Marginal Gang. His territory ranged from 14th Street up to 23rd, from about 8th Avenue to the piers. North of him was the domain of one of the most notorious of the Irish gangs, the Gophers. Spelled gopher but pronounced goofer, according to some sources. Since about 1909, O'Neill Madden has been their leader, and the press is starting to refer to them as the Maddens, just as the Marginals were sometimes called the Tanner Smiths. Below 14th Street is the realm of the Hudson Dusters. The Tanner Smith Gang's headquarters, the aforementioned Marginal Club, was on the second floor of a 3-story building located on 8th Avenue off of 16th Street. As the men play cards, 2 fellows enter. George Chick Lewis and Robert Shore, aka Rubber Shaw. Both men are known, so the game continues. Shore is especially welcome. He had been a marginal since adolescence, being arrested once at the age of 14 while acting as a gun-toter for the gang. Thanks to Smith's deep pockets, he was granted an early parole 2 months previous for another crime. Smith even went so far as to support him financially while he was behind bars. That was one thing everybody lauded about the new Tanner Smith: he was always there to help with the young men of the neighborhood that strayed from the path of righteousness. Men like Shore and Patrick the Link Mitchell, who, after being arrested for stealing $35,000 worth of Liberty bonds, could count on Smith to put up $15,000 for bail. Yes sir, Tanner Smith was now a right fellow. It wasn't always that way though. Arrested for the first time in 1907, by 1909 he was the head of the gang that bore his name. Within a year the whole neighborhood lived in fear of them. Shopkeepers refused to testify against them for their misdeeds, local taverns allowed them to drink for free to avoid trouble. When cops did arrest them, they could expect to be assaulted before getting their prisoner back to the precinct. The beatings went both ways, and Tanner received a sound thrashing on January 9, 1910. Early that day a young hoodlum named John Garrity was stabbed and told police that it was Tanner Smith who wielded the knife. Cops learned that Tanner was attending a dance at 42nd Street and 8th Avenue. One officer entered and told Tanner he was wanted outside. When I reached the landing of the first flight of stairs, Tanner would later testify, the police officer said, "This is the man we want," and then struck me on the head 3 times with a blackjack. 2 other cops cuffed him and also beat him about the head. Coincidentally, this occurred at the same time that newly elected New York City Mayor James Gaynor had outlawed police officers using their billy clubs unnecessarily in the line of duty. Along with this decree, Gaynor invited any victims of police violence to come forward. 5 days after his beating, Tanner showed up at the mayor's office with his face in bandages and wearing the blood-stained clothes he wore when arrested. He then relayed the story of his pounding. The cops insisted that Tanner cut up his face by falling down the stairs while attempting to escape. The defense also produced 20 cops and 6 local citizens to testify to the fact that Tanner was a hoodlum. In the end, 2 of the cops were fined 15 days' pay and the third, a month. Things worked out better for Smith. When appearing in court to answer for the assault on Garrity, the latter suddenly couldn't remember who stabbed him. One of those upset with the mayor's anti-clubbing initiative was a priest in Tanner's neighborhood. While not condoning police brutality, he stated that there is a possibility of carrying a reform too far. The police today are afraid to use their clubs, and consequently are as much in terror of the gangs as ordinary citizens. Not afraid to name names, he went on to complain about Tanner Smith and what he dubbed the Tanner Smith terrors. On July 2, 1911, Tanner and other gang members were firing off pistols at 27th Street and 11th Avenue. Hearing the shots, Officer Daniel Phelan approached and all the hoods ran off except for Tanner, who stood his ground. He fired a few shots at Phelan as the officer charged him. One report has Phelan tackling Tanner and holding him until reinforcements arrived. Another has Tanner throwing the officer to the ground and kicking him in the head. Whatever the truth, Tanner got a year in prison. Out in 1912, Tanner allied himself with another Westside gang leader, Oni Madden. It was in Tanner's domain that Madden, allegedly, killed William Henshaw, a possible Hudson Duster, on February 3, as the latter was climbing aboard a streetcar at 16th Street and 9th Avenue. Henshaw named Madden as his killer before dying. Officers arrested the gang leader on February 12. The following night, the Hudson Dusters decided to settle things with Tanner Smith and his boys. As the gang lounged in the Marginal Club, Hudson Dusters began to gather around the building in small numbers so as not to garner any attention. At one point, a few members started a fire around the block, and when the local beat cops ran to extinguish it, that's when they attacked. We're told, most likely an exaggeration, that upwards of 50 Hudson Dusters ran into the building and started shooting. The Tanner Smiths fought back and numerous shots were exchanged. The first floor of the building housed a small movie theater, and patrons ran out and mixed into the melee. By time the cops got there, all the gangsters had vanished, except for 4 Hudson Dusters who were found hiding on the roof. After the shoot-up at the Marginal Club, the gang opened a new hangout called the Winona Club around the block on 16th Street. They were evicted after a time, but on June 23, Tanner, along with half a dozen or so marginals, and fellow gang leader Oni Madden, re-entered the hangout by climbing through a window. They began to throw things at passers-by, and soon the cops showed up. As they pounded on the door, Tanner threatened to shoot any cop that crossed the threshold. Despite the warning, police forced their way in and arrested all for trespassing. Since Tanner was in possession of a gun, he was held without bail. All the others received 6 months for unlawful entry. Tanner ended up being sent away again in January of 1913. He was paroled on March 5, 1914. On June 18 of that year, Tanner and several of his subordinates got into a fight with some rivals. After a bit of arguing, the guns came out. Hearing the shots, police arrived on the scene and saw Tanner chasing a man while firing at him. A handful of other hoodlums were also on the run and managed to hop a fence and escape. Tanner, who would later admit he had too much to drink, simply threw his gun over the fence and waited for the cops to get him. The first cop arrived and Tanner started to fight him. Another showed up, and as they began to subdue the gang leader, a number of his followers came back and tried to help him escape. Luckily for the officers, a streetcar came by and they hoisted Tanner aboard and had the driver take them to the police station. This resulted in another prison term for Tanner. Sent away that September, he spent another year behind bars. When released in 1915, he did the unexpected. He took a job as a stevedore delivering meat to the ships along the Chelsea piers. A boon during World War I, even more so when America joined in. Supposedly he was a diligent worker, putting in 14-hour days. Working his way up to boss stevedore. Soon he was controlling his own operation, and by the end of the war he had hundreds of men working for him. With a payroll of $75,000 a week. As a waterfront boss, Tanner became quite affluent. According to his brother, he sported a $2,000 diamond ring. Over $36,000 in today's money. And wore a diamond stud, quote, as big as the ball of your eye. In addition to adorning himself in expensive baubles, Tanner also took control of the old Marginal Club on 8th Avenue. He paid the rent and maintained the joint so that his employees and any youth of the neighborhood had a safe place to hang out. Tanner also spent much of his time there whiling away the hours playing cards and dishing out jobs and handouts. Such was the Reformation, even the cops, his one-time enemies, considered him a great guy and neighborhood benefactor. Tanner also went to lengths to prove that he had turned a new leaf and wasn't the same Westside thug of just a few years ago. In July of 1919, the newspaper, the New York Sun, advertised that one of its journalists, Herbert Asbury, would be writing a series of articles about the gangsters of New York for their Sunday editions. A series that would lead to his seminal book, The Gangs of New York. The first installment appeared on Sunday, July 20th. On Friday the 25th, Asbury received a letter from Smith. "I am living straight now," Tanner informed him. "I have a good job and I have just got my citizenship back. If you say anything in your story about the Hudson Dusters or the Goofers, please say that." The next evening, Saturday, July 26, the sky illuminated by lightning, Tanner sat in his silk shirt playing cards at the Marginal Club. Behind him stood Robert Shore and George Lewis. There may have been tension between Shore and Smith. Even though Tanner stood behind him during his incarceration, making sure he received a stipend and paying $5,000 for a bond for an early release, Tanner did the unexcusable. Back in May, while Shore was still doing time, his girlfriend Grace Madden and another girl accompanied Tanner and some others to a dance. On the way home they dropped off Grace's friend, and when they got to Grace's, Tanner escorted her to the door. He came inside the vestibule and tried to kiss her. She tried to fight him off, but he grabbed her by the throat and tried harder. She bit him on the finger and screamed. Tenants came into the hall and Tanner fled. Word of the molestation got back to Shore, and when he was released a few weeks later, he asked Grace if the story was true. She confirmed it and pleaded with him to let it go. He assured her he would. But he couldn't. His anger grew and grew. Over the course of that July 26 evening, Shore and Lewis made many stops. Some drinks were had, but drunk or sober the decision had been made. Tanner Smith had to die for what he did to Shore's girl. Now, standing behind Tanner as he studied his cards, Shore drew his gun and fired a shot into the boss stevedore's back. He edged away from the table as Lewis approached and fired into the former gang leader as well. Tanner fell forward as his colleagues jumped from the table and either ran from the premises or into a hiding spot. Before the gunman fled, they fired another shot into Smith. While making their getaway, Tanner managed to lift himself from the table and draw his automatic. Staggering to the stairwell, he emptied his clip at Shore and Lewis, hitting only the wall. Stumbling back into the room, he dropped to the floor. One of the witnesses ran to Tanner's house and informed his family of the shooting. By the time they arrive, police and an ambulance are there, but the latter is unnecessary as Tanner is dead. Shore and Lewis flee to West New York, New Jersey and stay with the former's aunt. It's no secret that they are Tanner's killers, and detectives hope to find them before Tanner's loyal followers do. 2 days after the murder, the duo return to Manhattan and meet Grace and her friend at St. Michael's Church on 34th Street, where Shore and Madden tie the knot. Shore gives his new bride $5 so she and her maid of honor can go out to lunch, while he and Lewis hightail it back to Jersey. After the city mortuary was done with Tanner, he was sent home and his body laid out for all the neighborhood to come and pay their respects. On July 31st, he was moved to a church for his funeral. Finally, he was taken to the cemetery for burial. 2 large trucks were needed to transport the many floral tributes. After family and friends said their final goodbyes, it was time for payback. Patrick the Link Mitchell and some Confederates traced Shore and Lewis to New Jersey. Knowing that the duo had a rendezvous with 3 other men in Hoboken at 10 p.m. that night, they set up an ambush. When Shore and Lewis showed up, Link and his men opened fire on the duo. Shore dropped to the street mortally wounded, and Lewis managed to fire off a number of shots before dropping with 2 serious wounds. Shore was dead by the time the police arrived, and Lewis was sent to the hospital. Eventually he recovered and was put on trial for murder. He ended up pleading guilty to manslaughter and received 3 years in Sing Sing. On August 4, Hoboken police issued a warrant for the arrest of Link Mitchell. It was delivered to him personally at police headquarters in New York. He was in court that day for the opening of his trial for the Liberty Bond theft, the crime that Tanner had paid $15,000 to bail him out. Tanner's family swore that the Link was with them the night of the funeral and couldn't have been involved in the Hoboken shooting. The case against him fizzled out. Though he escaped justice, the Link couldn't escape a gangland death, but that's a story for another time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and consider subscribing.